Get started for today. I'm excited. Today's a big day because we're moving up to the third and final level of McAdams' framework of personality. So in today's class and in the following two classes, I'll be talking about life story, or the narrative level of our personality. My experience is that most students find it interesting. These lectures are a little bit different in that there isn't that much research on life stories and life narratives. So I'll tell you about some of the research, but I'm mostly going to give you examples of the way it might be done or the way you might apply it in your own life. So I'll be talking about life stories and identity. Today are, how can we study and analyze life stories? Yes. Here's McAdams' life story model of identity. The idea is that we define ourselves by constructing an autobiographical story of the self. It's not necessarily conscious. We just start doing it when we're 13, 14, 15. But then we do it more and more and more. It's part of what we do when we're just thinking. So he does believe it may be more of a modern phenomenon. So we live in a society and at a time when our lives are not scripted. We have to figure out our career direction. We have to figure out where we want to live. We have to figure out who our partners will be. He believes it's more of a Western phenomenon, and it's something that emerges developmentally. Some of us might start doing it earlier. Some of us might start doing it later. The value of the life story is it's the one thing that allows us to provide unity and coherence to our entire personality. So it's a way to make sense of how we were different when we were younger than we are now, and how we'll be in 15 years. It's also a way to make sense of like contradictory parts of us. So when I was an 18-year-old boy, I was a sports fanatic. I played sports. I liked sports. Yet in terms of music, I was listening to like musical comedies that 80-year-old people would listen to. So you won't find many people who are fanatics about sports and who are also listening to Julie Andrews records. It's a weird combination. But, you know, my life story can explain that. And it can explain contradictions in all of our lives. Or that's one of the things a life story can do. Now, the third point in McAdams' model, I'm going to spend a lot of time on it because I think it's the most interesting and I have some great examples. And you already know that autobiographical memories are not 100% accurate. In fact, they're often shaded. Sometimes they're even like made up or almost made up. And what McAdams would say is that, you know, to some extent, the facts aren't really as important as the meaning that people attribute to them. And he himself gives an example of an autobiographical memory that he carried around his whole life and that kind of defined his approach to his life. And then he found out that it wasn't quite right. So his example is that until he was about 50, he remembered that his dad had told him that when he was born, the doctor came to his dad and explained that he was born prematurely. And the doctor said he only has a 50-50 chance, meaning there was a 50% chance he'd survive, 50% chance he'd die. He did survive. He went to Harvard University, became a really significant personality researcher. He has 2 daughters. He's married to a federal judge. Throughout all of those experiences, he remembered that when he was born, he only had a 50-50 chance. And McAdams himself believed that that had an impact on him in 2 ways. One was he felt like he was very lucky to be alive, and he should really value the opportunities he had. But the second is he thought life is fleeting, and he has to be careful, and he has to be planful, and he has to be responsible. So he felt this one memory from what his dad told him had a big impact on the shape of his life. So his dad died when he was 50. And like a year later, he asked his mom, he said, "Mom, do you remember how Dad told me that I only had a 50-50 chance?" And she said, "No, he wouldn't have told you that. That wasn't true. You were born premature, but there was never any doubt. I mean, it was a good hospital. Kid survived. I don't know where you got that from." And his mom, who didn't have dementia or Alzheimer's, told him, "I don't know where you came up with this story." And he couldn't be sure that his dad had really told him that. But there's something in his memory that was a core bit. And he seems to have constructed it. So I'll give you another example. So this is a personal example. If you ask me, my favorite grade school teacher, I wouldn't hesitate. I went to a Catholic school, mostly had nuns as my teachers. In 5th grade, I had this teacher, Sister Julia, and 5th grade was the time when they allowed the nuns to shorten their habits and to wear dresses that were a little shorter. And I had remembered that Sister Julia was like the greatest teacher. She was lively, she was pretty, she was fun. I remembered that she had a guitar and she'd play songs. And I remembered that this was when I really came to like school. And I remembered that without ever seeing a picture of myself or my grade school class. And then a few years ago, my mom found this. And this is me somewhere, over here. And there's Sister Julia. And she seems like a nice person. But I had remembered her as the warmest, most beautiful embodiment of womanhood that you could imagine. And I couldn't figure out why I took this nice person and made her into this ideal. So this was 1969, and so I went back to look, and it turns out the most popular TV show at that time was The Flying Nun with Sally Field. And I remember liking that show and watching that show. The most popular movie of 1968 was The Singing Nun with Debbie Reynolds. And she played a guitar. And then I remembered that my favorite movie as a kid was The Sound of Music, where Julie Andrews played Maria or something. And then it occurred to me that I took Sister Julia there, and I made her into some fantastic conglomeration of the Singing Nun, the Flying Nun, and Julie Andrews. And she was a part of my memory of my school experience. But it was something that was shaded and constructed. And so what I'd like to suggest is that if we look at our memories, we'll find other examples of this. Now, the final example I'll give you, this is my favorite. You may have heard this before if you took social psychology. So my colleague and friend Mark Baldwin tells a story about, in his memory, one of his favorite or go-to stories is a spelling bee. And his memory is that he was at the school spelling bee, he was doing really well, it was just him and one girl left, and he was asked to spell the word vacuum. And he spelt it V-A-C-C-U-U-M. And then the teacher hit the bell, meaning, no, that's wrong. And I think it's with only one C. And he says he told this story many times. It was like a classic story. And then at a family gathering where his brother was at, he told this story, and his brother heard it, and he says, Mark, that was me. That's my story. Why have you taken my story? And Mark said, no, that's this. I remember the words, and I remember. And then they had a little exchange, and it turned out that Mark's brother remembered the word before, and the word before that. He remembered all the other contestants. He remembered the girl who won and what word she won on. And it was clear to everyone it was Mark's brother. So Mark, for some unknown reason, had taken a story about losing a spelling bee and inserted it into his life narrative. And I think this points to why it's so interesting to look at a life narrative. What do we choose to include? What do we choose not to include? What story are you trying to tell when you take something and, twist it in this way? So, I'll say more about this next class, but there's a fine line. We're allowed to shade. It's understood that some of the things in our life story can be somewhat inaccurate, but it's the meaning that's most important. However, if you start fabricating things and purposely adding things to your life story, that might be problematic. I'll give you some examples of that. Okay. So some of the key points of McAdams' model. The process begins in young adulthood, but important aspects of the life story are derived from earlier developmental periods. It turns out at the age of 5, we can already tell stories. But they're pretty simple stories. They're shorter. They involve just a few events. Usually at that age, you describe maybe how you were feeling and what you wanted to do, but you're not really good at giving motivation and an intention to the other people. But at age 5, we could tell a little stories. Now, as we get older, the stories we can tell get longer. We can connect different stories. And what you'll find is there's more causal and thematic coherence. And that means that as you're listening to the story, you say, yeah, that makes sense. This would lead to that. This would lead to that. Yeah. And even thematically. So, okay, this is all a story about, with the Amish woman, it's all a story about finding out who she is, how she wants to live, and how to break free. Now, in the McAdams chapter you'll find that there's developmental research that suggests your parents can play a big role in how quickly and how well you pick up the skill of telling stories. So some parents, first of all, they're model storytelling, but it's mostly in terms of asking you to elaborate, asking you about what happened, and then having you add details and fill in the picture. And the more you have a mom or dad who did that, the more you develop this capacity to tell, a more well-rounded, fuller story. Yeah. 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 You know, I'm glad you mentioned that, because a theme in this class has been extroversion and introversion. And I do think it's most likely that if we're more introverted, we probably have less experience telling stories than extroverted people would. But one of the things about introversion and extroversion, it depends on who you're with. So even an introverted person, when they're with their family, may be telling stories quite a lot and being reinforced for that. So I was certainly on the introverted end, but I think I got a lot of practice from my mom. Now, the other thing is, even if you're not telling other people's stories, we are telling the stories to ourselves. We're reliving these stories and these events. But it's only when we're 13, 14, 15 that we can write a whole chapter. Okay, so I took this from the book. I'll go through it pretty quickly because you'll be able to read about this. The key point is, one thing is, if you have stories from when you were less than 3 years old, those are almost certainly apocryphal. You were not there. You don't remember that. There's amnesia before age 3. So if we have stories from 2 years old, like the story I tell you about the turtle who scared the bejeebers out of me, that's a story that I heard from my mom, and then it became part. So the stories you have from when you were very young, a lot of those come from having been told them by your parents. Importantly, McAdams believes there's certain cultural scripts that may limit how we can tell a story. So that depending on whether you're from a very traditional, hierarchical cultural background, there might be a more narrow range of kinds of stories you can tell. One of the things you may have picked up on in the story I told and other stories is, I think I tell kind of an immigrant kid story. So my parents came from another place. We didn't really fit in. We didn't have holidays like other people did. My mom was kind of weird in her idea of what we should eat when we're traveling. We didn't stay at hotels with pools. I later found out we didn't do that because my mom was afraid we might drown. So that's the reason we never stayed at hotels with pools. She was correct. But your cultural background, your specific life circumstances may dictate the menu of possibilities you have. So if you're a child of immigrants, you're more likely to tell a story where there's a lot of respect for what your parents did, how they made sacrifices for you. There's probably a lot of emphasis on working hard to kind of make the dream of your parents come true. But if you're not an immigrant, you know, that's not as likely to be part of the menu of possibilities. Now, one way to think about these stories, McAdams would say we're all basically novelists. And next class, I'll show you that the way he analyzes a life story is the way you'd analyze a novel or a film. You want to see what the key themes are. You want to see whether it's well structured. Is the plot believable? Are the characters well drawn? But think of it as, you know, in your own mind, you're like a novelist. So here's the narrative process. From adolescence through young adulthood, we construct an identity by experiencing events, narrating those experiences to others, editing the narrations in response to others' reactions, experiencing new events, narrating those new events in light of past narrations, and so on and so on. So it's like we're novelists and we're on the 200th draft of the life story. And we keep changing earlier things because of things that happen later on. And what McAdams would say is not just a historical thing. We're not just trying to keep track of the facts. It actually changes who we are as we change this life story. So I read you that quote of the Amish lady when she was only 12. And she said, I felt like I would change things, but I could not do it at this moment. But later on I could, and I did. And she kind of makes a laugh at that point too. Now when she was 12, I'm not sure in her story whether she would have narrated it that way. But at some point, she gained, in her story, she started thinking about herself as wanting to resist and wanting to free herself from the conventions of the Amish culture that she was growing up in. And it's at the point that her story added that component that she probably became more able to actually change her life and to make the moves that she later made. So there's an importance, there's a functional importance to this story. And I'll say more about that as we go on. Now, the kind of stories, the kind of life narrative we're writing changes as we get older. What you're likely to be writing for the next few years is the coming of age story. Most novels you read are coming of age stories. Most great writers, the first great book they write is something about a young person who figures out who they are and what they're going to do in their lives. And what that story focuses on is identity and intimacy. And that can continue for quite a while, but someone who's my age should actually begin writing a different story. And McAdams would say that at my age, it should be about generativity. So instead of talking about how I met my wife or how I figured out what I was going to do, it should be more about my role as a mentor, a teacher, a parent. Now the next stage, your grandparents, my mom's 85, at that stage, it's not even about generativity anymore. Instead, it's kind of trying to take a final shot at organizing everything that's happened in your life and seeing if you can make it into a meaningful whole. And it's really important how older people manage that, because the final life stage the struggle is between feeling like you've led a life of integrity versus a pointless life that leads you to despair. Now, there's a lot of evidence that older people really benefit from telling you their life story. So here are some headlines from the New York Times over the last few years. Elders need to tell their life stories to preserve their legacies. Telling their life stories, older adults find peace in looking back. Even Alzheimer's patients who have serious memory losses, they benefit from telling autobiographical memories. So the process probably continues throughout the life. You're just starting, but it will continue into the future. Okay. The coming of age, which you're working on now, I've told you a lot of stories in this class, and in my human motivation course I tell stories too. One of the things I did a couple of years ago was I listed all my stories and tried to figure out how old I was when the things happened. And it turns out 60% of the stories I tell happened between the age of 18 and 24. I'm now 60 years old, so that's only about 10% of my life, but it's 60% of my stories. I was a little worried that I might be preoccupied with my young adulthood, but it turns out this is what all of us are likely to do. There's something very special about young adulthood, so that later on in life, when we reminisce, we'll often go back to that period. So I'll describe a study which looked at something called the reminiscence bump. And this has to do with how we remember more events from late adolescence and early adulthood than any other period. It was a 2008 experiment. There were 50, it was all with 50-year-olds. And they wanted to elicit memories. So what they did was they first said, provide us with 20 I statements. This is a measure of identity where you give people a piece of paper, you put the number 1 to 20, and you ask them to say 20 I statements. So like, I'm a professor, I'm a father, I'm a Catholic, I live in Montreal. And people can put 20 things that kind of describe themselves. Then in this study they said, okay, choose 3 of those and give 10 memories related to each of those identities. So for every 50-year-old in the study, they collected 30 memories. For every memory, they asked, how old were you when this happened? And these were 50-year-olds. And what they found was that the average age of the memory was 23. And that most of the memories, more than half, were between 18 and 24. So there's something really significant. Now, one reason why 18 to 24 is significant is because that's when we develop a clear understanding of who we are and what our role in the world will be. But the research I'm telling you about was actually by cognitive psychologists, and they noticed, or they highlighted the fact that when we're 18 to 24, that's when our brains are maximally capable of remembering and organizing memories. So there's a sharpness and there's something special about the memories from that age. Okay, so there's a centrality of young adulthood. The other thing McAdams says is we're working on our stories for a long time. We're redrafting them. We're hearing other people's stories. Ideally, our stories should be getting better. We may have started out with some pretty simple, routine kind of life stories, but they should become more complex and more differentiated. By complex, what's meant is the story should be able to take in more and more different aspects of your life, including some things that are contradictory. By differentiated, what is meant is that all of us include other characters in our life stories. So my life story, my sister plays a role, my mom, my dad, my brother, my wife, my daughter. One of the things that happens in terms of differentiation is that when we first tell the story as young adults, it's mostly from our point of view. And we do a good job of describing our motivation. But we don't really do such a good job of filling out the details of the other characters. What was their motivation? Why were they acting like that? Why was your mom always being so demanding and difficult? So one of the things that should happen in a good life story is that we make it richer in terms of providing a better understanding of the other characters in our story. So we provide more of a backstory for the other people. I won't say too much about this here because I'm going to go on to this in the next class, but there are links between the life story and the big 5 traits, and there are links between the big 3 motives, and there are links with life stages, and there are also relationships to well-being that you can identify when you code. But I'll do that next class more fully. I think something that I'll focus on now is that they have looked at differences based on our cultural background. Like in most of psychology, the one cultural difference that researchers really seem to focus on is East versus West, so that people from Japan, India, China are thought to be more interdependent in their conception of themselves, whereas people from North America and Europe are thought to be more independent in their conception of themselves. McAdams cites some research that suggests that autobiographical memory and the life story are somewhat different if you're from a Western culture versus an Eastern culture. One thing that comes through is that North Americans have earlier first childhood memories. They have more detailed childhood memories. The childhood memories are focused on themselves. It's usually a one-time event. And the key to most of Westerners, like myself, the key to our childhood memories is that when I tell you the story, it shows you how I'm unique, how I'm special, how I stand out. That's not the case with the childhood memories of people with an Asian background. So rather than being focused on the self, there's a greater emphasis on the self in interaction with others. In fact, there's a tendency for a lot of memories to be organized in terms of other important people. So you have a cachet of memories associated with your aunt or your uncle or someone who's significant to you. Whereas I just have memories about myself in a sports setting, in a school setting, in a different kind of setting. If you're from an Asian background, the story doesn't end with, boy, wasn't I a unique kid? It's more likely to end with, here's what I learned from that experience. Here's what I learned and what could make me a better person. So there are some cultural influences on the way we remember things, and that will be filtered into the life stories. Okay. Here are some questions I think many of you might have. What if you're not really a storyteller. You are a storyteller. You may be shy, you may not tell other people your story, but you've told yourself many, many stories, and you're probably working at this process. We're actually all better storytellers than we realize. It's just a matter of finding an audience that we're comfortable with quite often, or finding a way to tell stories. My big problem with this life narrative research is for a long time I wasn't sure it was quantifiable. I'm not interested in qualitative research. I like to have a large sample. I like to be able to predict from my personality variable to some important outcome. And the life narrative research has struggled with generating kind of a quantifiable indicator. I'll show you there are a couple that I think we can use. How much can the story change in adulthood? It can change dramatically. And in fact, I think McAdams would suggest many of us should try to change the way we're telling our story. He actually, I think, suggests that we should do things like keep a diary or try writing out some chapters of what our memoir would be like. That even though it's largely an unconscious process, it's helpful to try to work on it in a conscious way. I'll talk next class about how psychotherapy might influence it, but the basic idea is that the one thing that's constant across all types of psychotherapy is that you get to tell your story, even if you come for some other reason, and you get a chance to see how the counselor or therapist reacts, and you may have a chance to tell it differently. Now, if any of you were in a spelling bee, or if you would like to include a memory of how your spelling bee went, I showed this to my friend Mark a couple of years ago, because I think it's time for him to take that memory of his brother's spelling bee out, and I suggested that he put this one in.
Tokonoma.
I don't know if you saw this, but this is great.
T-O-K-O-N-O-M-A. Tokonoma.
Arvind, that is correct, and since you are the only speller remaining in round 15, if you spell correctly this next word, you will be declared the 2013 Scripps National Spelling Bee Champion.
He says, okay.
No pressure.
Enough
Wait till
applause.
you see his reaction.
Woo.
Canadal.
Canadal. May I have the language of origin, please?
German-derived Yiddish.
No way.
Now be careful here.
May I have the
Look at
definition,
his
please?
expression.
Canadal or knadel is a small mass of leavened dough cooked by boiling or steaming, as with soup, stew, or fruit, with which it is to be served. It's a dumpling.
You can't hold it back.
Max hoped to find at least one more canadal in his soup bowl, but all he discovered was his missing lower denture.
Canadal. Are there any alternate pronunciations?
There's just canadal and knadel.
Canadal. K-N-A-I-D-E-L. Canadal.
So that's the spelling bee memory I recommend you insert in your autobiography. It's a really good one. I'll continue on this next class and give more detail about how the stories could be coded.